Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Kijo Lee, Assistant Director of Academic Affairs at the Cleveland Museum of Art. I'm delighted to welcome you to Close Looking at a Distance. The idea that giving deep and sustained attention to works of art can not only impact the way we visit museums, but also expand our understanding of the world. We're going to start in a minute, but first we're going to wait for our guests to log in. In the meantime, please familiarize yourself with the Q&A interface to the right of your screen. Because while Latanya and I have ideas about the photographs we'll be viewing today, Close Looking at a Distance is really driven by you, our audience. So we hope that the Q&A is alive with responses to the questions we'll ask you along the way, as well as any other comments or questions that you have. When you post, you can feel free to include your name or remain anonymous. We'll also use that Q&A to post links to the artworks that we show and any other resources that we mention. While social distancing remains a reality in our galleries, in Close Looking at a Distance, we've taken the experience of spending time together discussing artworks virtual. This program, along with desktop dialogues led by my colleague Andrew Cappetta, are dedicated to engaging art objects that challenge the way we see and how we understand complicated and under-recognized histories and narratives. In this program, we pursue those stories through the practice of collective close looking, of seeking meaning as we move from detail to detail as a group. In last week's desktop dialogue program on care and curatorial practice, it introduced my guest, Tanya Autry, and her approach to creating exhibitions that prioritize the well-being of their audiences as much as the artworks on display. Welcome, Latanya.
Hi, thank you for having me on the program, Keisha. This is wonderful.
We're so happy to have you. And Latanya is the current Gund Curatorial Fellow at the Museum of Contemporary Art Cleveland, where she curated Temporary Spaces of Joy and Freedom, which opened earlier this year and is still on view. Her other exhibitions include Let Us March On, Lee Friedlander and the Prayer Pilgrimage for Freedom at Yale University Art Gallery in 2017, and The Art of Black Descent, a traveling exhibition that has been moving to various sites since 2016. And so for this week's session, I asked Latanya to pick an image or two that we could look at more closely together, and she chose this photograph by Lee Friedlander. It's Untitled, from the series called Prayer Pilgrimage for Freedom, taking its name from the event that's being photographed from 1957. Before Latanya and I begin talking, though, I'd like to ask our audience, what's the first word that comes to mind when you see this image? Put your responses in the Q&A now. And can we make sure that the full image is up on the screen, please? And Latanya, while we wait for our audience's responses, please tell us why you picked this photograph in particular to talk about.
Yeah, thanks. This is, one of 58 photographs in this series, and it's one of my favorites. I have probably 4 or 5 favorites in this group, but this is in my top 2. And it's one that I feel like warrants attention more than I was able to give it at the time. And I've always wanted to kind of come back to it. And I feel like this could be a full essay just on this particular photograph. So I would love to think about it with everybody today to hear ideas.
That's wonderful. So you still have questions about this image, even though you spent some time with this series, and you're hoping that our collective looking can help you address some of those. Let's check in with the audience. We're not seeing any responses yet. So I will ask you, Latanya, if you had only one word to describe this work, what would it be?
Yeah, this is such a hard one. I keep thinking if I should change my word. I'm not sure. I'm going to stick with stark. I think of it as a stark image in a way, and stark is about contrast, but also about the fullness of it as well. So,
So stark. And then from our audience, anonymous comment is a plea for freedom or for recognition to be heard and seen. So I think we'll choose plea as the word that we stick with, and we'll come back to that. We're just going to think about some of these words. Uplifting, you're coming in hot and fast now. And then someone is saying that they even hear the sound the crowd is making and the waving of the paper document. So something about it being having a sound quality, being loud in some way. And so thinking about that, we have now seen with you, with Stark, thinking about the composition itself. We have a plea for freedom, which is a kind of interpretive, interpreting the content. So thinking about what those upraised hands might mean, uplifting, what is the mood that this is setting, and then hearing something, a sound. So all of these other senses that this image is appealing to. So even in this few minutes, we've seen that we have all of these various ways, not only of describing what we're seeing, but aspects that we're focusing on are distinct. And I think that I also was thinking when I looked at this work about the composition is what struck me first, the contrast between that white sky and all of the people in the crowd.
Mm.
What do you, so I want to push this a little bit further, and we're seeing lots more description. So I see energy. From Anonymous, Leslie says that they feel a great intensity. They feel that everyone is attentive and responsive. Jen DePrizio used the word perspective. We have relevant, presence from Heinel, liberation, formality, about dress and gestures, engagement, hopeful, church hats, unified. So we're seeing again that while we're all looking at the same image, the details that we're keying into are distinct. I want to ask, for those folks who have selected a mood or a description like unified or a word like perspective, what do you see specifically in the image that makes you say that? And so when you put in your reply, please put the word that you're focusing on, and then what part of the photograph makes you think of that. And Latanya, for Stark, is there a detail you could point to that makes you think of that word, Stark?
Yeah, for me, it's definitely I'm thinking about that contrast, very high contrast between the whites and, there are some grays, but it seems like very dark areas and very white areas. So the sky is contrasted to like the people's, the jackets, the hair, even the hands that are raised up. It's just such a sharp contrast between the two. And I would say also like the sky being so pretty much empty, where we don't see clouds the way that this is photographed. But we see all of these people down at the bottom, half of the image horizontally. And so it makes it have this real strong kind of sense of like being a complete kind of area, as opposed to the other area feeling incomplete or empty.
Yeah, yes. I think I hear and understand what you're saying. There's that very distinct, almost a horizon line. It makes me almost think of a landscape image where you have this very distinct line that shows you where the earth rounds, for lack of a better description. And that sky, it's not just empty, it's that haziness. It's truly mysterious to me, especially because of the clarity of the figures in the foreground. So I really get your point about that contrast, that distinction made up of those two very distinct planes that they're showing in the image. Let's go back to what the audience is saying. Someone used the word solidarity. And it says, and they say that it seems that most of the people are African American, therefore likely unified in purpose for attending the event. And so in looking at even the backs of these figures, we can see some details that have us think that this is a primarily African American crowd. Like for me, I can think of the color of people's skin as an indicator of race here. And I'd be interested if anyone had any other, or if this audience member, if there were any other details that had them think that these were this is an African American crowd, but noting that, I can absolutely see how we can think of this as a unified crowd and therefore a unified purpose. And then Heinel says about presence that she sees jewelry, beautiful hats, people standing up straight and holding up papers high in the air. So their posture and comportment gives them a sense of presence or weight. And LaTanya, I remember that when we've spoken about this photograph in the past, we thought about compositional weight here. I was wondering if you might say a little bit more about that.
Yeah, definitely. What I like about this picture too is thinking about balance, right? When you think about compositions, we think about like the weight, like where areas have more weight versus less. And I know we talked about like the building being on the side, right, where you can see just a sliver of the corner of Lincoln Memorial, or one might suppose that is. You might not know it is, but you might suppose. So this is in Washington, D.C. on the National Mall. And it's interesting to think about, like, usually architecture like that will, ground an image or something. And it's interesting, like, for on the other side, we don't have anything. And it might seem, as people who study this, that the picture is weighted towards the left. But actually, with all of these people, the sea of people down at the bottom, I mean, I feel like it pulls the image down in a way. I mean, like I'm talking so much like an art historian, but I think anybody might see this too, right? So, and not just because I'm crazy and spending way too long studying this, but I feel like the image it does have interesting, like it feels off balance, but balanced at the same time. So it kind of has a sense of motion in addition to having those hands, being raised up in the air, and it looks like, waving the whatever they're holding, their programs or something.
Yeah. Yes. You've touched upon several comments that the audience has made. First of all, you answered a question. Someone said they wondered what that building is. So we now know that it's the Lincoln Memorial, which just adds to our catalog, right, of knowledge about this image. And in thinking about that composition, the ways in which it's decentered. So we often think about balance as requiring like a central ballast or a central focus in order for photography and other media, but for photography, that moving just to the left or the right gives you a lot more visual interest. And again, though, even though there is also, there is a balance between the weight of the figures and the emptiness of the sky, having those hands upraised, to my mind, does provide that balance that is needed against the architecture. Even that sort of shooting up, that uplift, that raised hand as a mirror for those sort of soaring pillars on the Lincoln Memorial. Seems to link to that, as well as, again, back to this idea of solidarity and unification, thinking that with everyone looking in the same direction. And someone else noted an idea of togetherness. So we're seeing in that close sort of crush of people, a feeling seems to be emerging among what our audience is seeing of solidarity, of unification, of closeness. And to me, that speaks of a kind of warmth. And someone said, we are here, like it's a declarative sort of movement. Let's see. Oh, so could we say more about the Lincoln Memorial? We have an anonymous comment that the Lincoln Memorial stands for civil rights and peaceful approach for change. So I'm wondering about the role of architecture in this photograph. And you've said a little bit about that, but is that an aspect that you're thinking about as you're interpreting this image?
Oh yeah, for sure. So this march from '57 is a really critical moment in the civil rights history and Black liberation history. A lot of people don't know about the prayer pilgrimage, but yeah, the organizers particularly wanted this to be on the Lincoln Memorial. They were making a statement, and we know, years, in recent years, many people constantly kind of do events in front of the Lincoln Memorial and make those kind of references, sometimes, presidents standing in front of it, trying to make a reference to how they are leading the country and putting that connection with Lincoln or trying to create that. These activists in '57, the people who are up on the platform, but also the people on the ground, I really try not to call them a crowd because they actually are freedom fighters. They are, really just they are just as important to me as the people who were up on the platform who showed up that day. This was a really big deal for African Americans to take time off, travel across the country. And this is the first time that there is an event like this that's happening on the National Mall, this African Americans, and really fighting for their rights, fighting against voter suppression, racial violence, the fact that segregation is still going on after the Brown decision of '54. And so it's this really key moment. Of course, those are all still problems we still got to deal with. So anyway, still the Lincoln Memorial has that kind of draw, right? It still has that draw of people thinking of coming to the nation's capital and occupying that space. So the where it is has got a lot to do with everything, why they're there.
Yeah. And I think even that idea of the compositional motion that you were describing before, how you felt like all of those balanced imbalances in the composition implied a kind of movement, to me also speaks to a kind of mobility that some of the audience has been noting in this idea of a unified moving toward something. And we have another anonymous comment that says that without any other details, but seeing the Lincoln Memorial, it seems clear that this is a patriotic type setting where the crowd is applauding and agreeing with whatever message is being delivered. And some agreement from our audience also about the dynamic aspects in that motion. But then also we have someone who's pointing to the verticality of this composition. So even though part of that balance is also having these multiple verticals that are moving across. So we can see how not just having that crowd in this photograph, but also the structure of the composition itself both lend themselves to thinking about this as a unified, an idea of unification, an idea of solidarity or togetherness isn't only displayed in the crowd itself, but in the overall composition.
Yeah. It's interesting because with this image, I would say I was definitely thinking of, these people are all together, the people who showed up this day, and the fact that they're all looking in that one direction and the hands raised. But I also get this feeling often when I look at this, and I always feel weird about saying it, but I feel like it's almost makes me think of a crucifixion. And this might be the formal aspects and then also kind of knowing about the history, but something about that very strong vertical and then that really strong horizontal as well. And then adding, the knowledge of what was happening in the 50s and why people were showing up, why they were going to do that. And really, it's a big deal for them. And it's like they're kind of putting themselves on the line, their lives on the line, so to say, really putting their lives on the line to show up and to occupy that space. And so I've been thinking about like a crucifixion scene with this.
That's really interesting. So even to get a little bit meta or, about it, pulling way out on that composition and looking at it as though it were on a grid. If you were to lay it out, what's the strong X and Y axis that we're seeing present and what that can mean? It makes me think of, and then we're going to return right back to the audience comments. There is a Matthew Gardner, and I will make sure I did not cue this up to our production folks. I apologize. There is a Matthew Gardner photograph of Abraham Lincoln that's at in the archives of the National Portrait Gallery, and there's a crack in it. There was a crack in the negative, and Gardner printed it even with that crack. So there is a line in the print that goes nearly the pathway of the bullet that eventually kills Lincoln. And so there have been some imaginative thinking about that photograph as sort of predicting, Lincoln's impending doom. Now, this is not anything proven, in fact, but there are these kinds of resonances that if you pull out far enough from a composition can help you to unearth some interesting thinking about those, how images can reflect history. But I do, please go ahead, Latanya, and then
No, I said thank you for that. That's really helpful to know. I'm going to look that up, actually. Thank you.
Yeah. So we have lots of folks who are picking up a lot on the formal properties of the photograph. So people are thinking about the circular shapes of the hats versus the straight verticals of the pillars, which also provide that contrast, that kind of a little bit of friction there. We have the verticality, are also maybe thinking about other monuments that are in that same area. So the Washington Monument that is sort of off out of view here. The pattern of white, black rhythm in the clothes, the skin, and the papers. Someone's asking, and maybe Latanya, if this event was before or after Marianne Anderson's concert at the Lincoln Memorial?
So she was before. She was before. And, it was because really they wouldn't allow her to perform. I forget the building she was supposed to perform in, but it was, some racist thing where they wouldn't allow her to perform. So she performed outside in front of the Lincoln Memorial. And yes, that is definitely on their minds at the time, the people who were there and people who organized it. And also at this event, Mahalia Jackson was kind of the big draw, actually, for a lot of those people to show up, because she's a civil rights activist and also a very well-known gospel singer. And so she was there and singing up on that platform and kind of making that connection with Marianne Anderson from years before.
Thank you for that. Thank you. And although we are amazingly sort of pulling into the home stretch of our first 30 minutes, I want us to think about a question that an anonymous audience member asked. They say this image was just one of many from that day. For discussion, why choose the photo with no faces so everyone is anonymous for us to discuss?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I picked this one on purpose because it was one that isn't like all the other ones. You do pretty much see the people's faces. This one I thought was interesting because where the vantage point of the photographer is in this, and the fact that this is a event that's African Americans mostly who are there, thousands of folks who showed up. It's mostly African Americans and fighting for their rights. And in this case, Lee Friedlander is this young white man that was there on the ground photographing people. And in this case, out of all the pictures in the series, there's this one picture where he is embedded on the ground with the demonstrators. And I really thought about, he tried to get these pictures published. He was not able to find anybody to publish them at the time in 57 for Life magazine or something, like those big kind of places like that. And I thought a lot about why those publishers of these white publications were not interested in this series. And I thought, this picture to me seems so forward thinking, actually, of all the pictures, of thinking of would white magazine readers be able to identify and see themselves? Because in a way, we don't know who the photographer is. It puts whoever the viewer is also with these people and part of this teeming mass of people fighting for their rights. And I feel like this is a very future-oriented kind of picture that was not what people in 57 for those white publications could see themselves like that. They were not pushing their readers or their viewers into that kind of viewing experience, I think, at the time. So that's some theory that I'm interested in like, basically going down that route and thinking about it more.
Yeah, what are the means of drawing the audience into that unification that our audience is noting, even if they aren't African American? How can it be that this speaks to an American,
right,
unification of message about all of the folks who are standing here, and how does it imply that we are participants, or could be, to your idea, in the future, participants in all of this solidarity, unification, and, as noted, kind of jubilation, even with this backdrop that you have placed of this crucifixion, this sort of sacrifice that is implicated, right, in that unification. So we only have about 4 minutes left in this part of our discussion, and it's been fascinating to witness how starting with sort of a single idea can inspire a deep visual investigation of a single artwork. When we move to Zoom, I think that we will continue to talk about the Friedlander, but we will also, if we have time, take a look at a photograph by Sheila Pre-Bright called Mothers March On, which was installed recently in New York, and we'll see an image of that installation.
It's in Atlanta.
In Atlanta, excuse me, thank you. But before we transfer to Zoom, we'd like to pause here to hear from the audience once more. So to help us shape future Close Looking programs, please respond to the poll that's being posted in the Q&A right now. We'd like to know what you found most valuable in this session. Was it new ways to describe what you see, new questions to ask when you approach an artwork, surprising historical connections, or some other aspect? And if it's other, if you'll take the time to put details in the Q&A as well, we'd really appreciate that. Thanks for that and for being with us for this first half of the program. Next week on Desktop Dialogues, Andrew Cappetta will be in conversation with Erica Anthony, the co-founder of Cleveland Votes and the executive director of the Ohio Transformation Fund, to discuss how artists have represented the democratic process in the United States from voting to protest, and how art plays a role in shaping civic participation and inciting political change. We'd also like to give special thanks to the National Endowment for the Humanities for providing the funding to support Close Looking at a Distance and Desktop Dialogues. LaTanya and I are really eager to get to more of your comments and questions in the next half hour, so please meet us over in Zoom after you've completed the poll, and we want that next 30 minutes to be even more interactive. So when you get to Zoom, please leave your cameras on if you feel comfortable with that, and turn your mics off so that you can answer in real time. We'll ask you to raise your hand, and we'll call on individuals so you can either speak live, and of course the comment section will still be open to you if you don't feel comfortable expressing yourself through your video camera. And while we're allowing people a minute to continue completing the poll, what we're seeing so far is that surprising historical connections is pulling out in an early lead. But just to think about the transitions, are there some things that have come up about this image today, LaTanya, that have enhanced your thinking?
Oh yeah, definitely. I love this, as we've been talking a lot about what inspires this feeling of solidarity and togetherness, and, thinking about that contrast of the formal aspects is really helping me think about this image in much deeper ways. So love it. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Wonderful. So that is it for this Teams portion of our program. We hope to see you all over in Zoom in just a moment. Remember to leave your cameras on and turn your mics off. See you in a minute.